Hello and welcome to this IDPC webinar on the 2018 Commission on Narcotic Drugs. It will be the 61st session of the Commission. This is the second in our series of webinars on the CND. The first already happened. That was in French last Friday, and you can still access that online or tell your French colleagues about it. And tomorrow there will be a third webinar in Spanish, which will be at 5 p.m. London time. So that's on the Tuesday, the 6th of March at 5 p.m. London time. And obviously this webinar, again, will be offline after we finish today. So thank you very much for joining us. Please feel free to ask your questions in the comments section of the of YouTube, and we have someone who's moderating the questions. And at the end, myself and my co-presenters, who I'll introduce in a moment, will be available to answer your questions. So firstly, just to briefly introduce the IDPC, the International Drug Policy Consortium. We're a global network of 175 NGOs from over 60 countries around the world. We promote drug policies based on the principles of human rights, of health, of development, of social inclusion. And one of our key mandates is really to facilitate the participation of civil society in drug policy making debates. So that might be at the national level, at the regional level, in regional structures, but also the purpose of this webinar at the international level and at the United Nations. I also want to highlight that this webinar is not going to give you the basics of how the Commission on Narcotic Drugs works. We've actually created a video for the first time this year, a 101 on the CND, which you can also access at this link now that you can see here. And that will give you really the key information of how the CND works, what the difference is between the plenary sessions and the committee of the whole, the purpose of resolutions. And I think if you haven't been to the CND before, in addition to watching and being part of this webinar, you should definitely have a look at our video. So in this webinar, we're going to be just outlining some of the key issues and opportunities at the upcoming CND in March. We will also be outlining and pointing you towards some key resources for civil society who will be participating at the CND. And I'm also delighted to welcome two of our IDPC members who will also be speaking at this webinar and giving you their perspectives from their experiences of having attended the CND and you know, sharing that with you in terms of how you might want to navigate the CND should you be coming in next week. In fact, sorry, it is next week. So firstly, we'll have Gabriel Santos, who's from the Brazilian Drug Policy Platform. Welcome, Gabriel. And then followed by Sofía Galinaki from Diogenis in Greece. So they'll both be speaking a little later on. So, yeah, moving on, it's going to be, as I mentioned earlier, the 61st session of the CND in Vienna. It will take place all of next week, starting from Monday the 12th and finishing on Friday the 16th of March. This CND will be chaired by the Mexican Ambassador Buenrostros, and she will be sitting in the plenary the whole week and chairing those discussions. In parallel to the plenary, we'll have the committee of the whole that's currently being chaired by Kenya, who are the vice chair from the Africa group, who will be overseeing the negotiations of the resolutions. The full program of the CND next week is already online, and you can check that out for yourself in terms of wanting to see when key events are happening. The timings in there in terms of when agenda items appear are useful as a guide, but sometimes agenda items do overrun, so please be prepared for that. Just a few things in terms of the plenary session to point your attention towards that may be of interest, because usually there's you know, the first day is the opening on Monday, and they'll have a general debate where there's a lot of country statements and regional statements, and that usually takes all of Monday and sometimes into Tuesday, depending on how long the member states' statements are. And that can be interesting to hear the different perspectives of countries on their general thoughts around the state of international drug control. And then just highlighting a few things. On Tuesday, there will be the discussion of the votes on the scheduling of substances. So this is when the WHO, who has been looking at which new substances or existing substances, whether they should become under international control or not, this will come back to the CND for their consideration, and they will vote in some cases on whether substances should be scheduled at the international level and under which schedules they should be placed, and that will happen on Tuesday. On Thursday, there will be also an interesting discussion on item number 7, which will be a follow-up on the 2016 UNGAS. We see this as probably a continuation of some of the discussions we have already seen last year during the intersessionals, where member states report back on their operationalization of the UNGAS outcomes. Then on the same day, under item 8, also an interesting discussion, they will address interagency cooperation within the UN. And again, we see this as an interesting discussion, because this is an ongoing issue on how to improve interagency cooperation at the UN on the issue of drugs. And we hope that several of the UN agencies will also be there to participate within this discussion. Then on Friday, there will also be 2 important discussions. The first will be around, on item 10, contributions of the CND to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Again, a very important issue for us as civil society, wanting to ensure that international drug control contributes to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, and how to ensure that they are aligned, and rather than basically drug control policies actually undermining some of the priorities we see in the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, and it is interesting that they've left this item until the Friday afternoon, is the preparations for the 2019 ministerial segment. So there has already been agreement at the last CND in March 2017 through a resolution 60/1, that there would be in 2019 a high-level ministerial segment attached to the 62nd CND in March 2019. That is the opportunity for when member states will come together, reflect on the progress made over the last 10 years since they agreed the Political Declaration and Action Plan in 2009, and somehow point the way forward for the forthcoming 10 years following from 2019. I'll come on to that a bit later on, because that's a big key part of the discussion for this CND. But again, the full program, the link is there should you want to see it, and there's a lot of detail in that. In addition to the plenary discussions, as I mentioned, there will also be the discussion of resolutions in the Committee of the Whole, operates all week in parallel with the plenary, and when resolutions have been agreed by the Committee of the Whole, they come to the plenary for adoption. The resolutions are already online. There are 11 resolutions this year. I'm not going to go through all of them. We're just going to highlight a few that firstly we think are quite worrisome and problematic, and I think if you're there at CND and you have the opportunity to engage with member state colleagues, particularly those who we know are supportive of the harm reduction and human rights agenda, these are resolutions that you would want to raise with them. And then also there are some really progressive resolutions this year, which we also want to draw your attention to. So firstly, on the more problematic resolutions, one of the first ones we see is there's always usually a resolution around children at the CND, and this one is being proposed by Russia. Resolution L2 is the current number, protecting children from the illicit drug threat. And this one we consider to be problematic because it only considers the rights of the child through preventing drug use in the context of demand reduction. It's not really balanced in terms of taking a more comprehensive health-based approach to drugs, which encompasses prevention as well as treatment, rehabilitation, and harm reduction. But of course, at the UN level, that word becomes a phrase around measures aimed at minimizing the health and social consequences of use. The other strange thing contained in this resolution is a strong condemnation of initiatives around cannabis regulation, but we find that these mentions are unfounded and unsubstantiated, based singularly on one paragraph drawn from the World Drug Report for 2016. And not drawing on any of the wider evidence on the issue. So we see that one as somewhat problematic and definitely a resolution that could be more balanced. The next one is resolution L4. This has been proposed by Pakistan. Strengthen efforts to prevent drug abuse in educational settings. We see this again as somewhat problematic. It reaffirms a society free of drug abuse as a key objective of the resolution, which is language that, the drug-free language is language that we've been encouraging governments to move away from, given that it has justified quite harsh measures at the national level to move towards a society free of drugs, rather than thinking about health and well-being and those kind of broader outcomes that are based more strongly in human rights principles. And we think that this resolution could link more strongly to objectives included in the Sustainable Development Goals more specifically. So we think that one is a little challenging. The other problem with this one is that it calls on the UNODC Executive Director to report back to the CND at the 63rd session, which will actually take place in 2020, but puts that in terms of reporting back on the 2009 political declaration. And as the targets in that declaration end next year, we see this as an attempt to perhaps extend the targets, and that's something we need to push back on. Finally, on the problematic side, there is enhancing international cooperation to combat the synthetic opioid crisis. This is from the US. And of course, we were expecting to see something from the US on their current overdose crisis. But again, with this resolution, it is very much focused on law enforcement activities and interdiction efforts, and really doesn't incorporate the more important health based response as well, and it needs to be more balanced. There's lots of language in the UNGAS outcome document that could be drawn upon around overdose prevention, specific mention of naloxone. So again, we see this last as L6 as a little unbalanced. Moving on to some of the more positive or progressive resolutions. The first one, L3, this is the one that's probably going to consume most of the time during the CND in terms of what member states will be negotiating over, but we're unlikely to see much of that negotiation in the Committee of the Whole. A lot of that will take place in what's called informal informals, where they'll probably be doing a lot of discussion and horse trading around this resolution. It's already been discussed at length in Vienna, and it's, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's around defining what will happen in the lead up, but also next year in 2019 for the ministerial segment. And it's quite important that we advocate strongly around this resolution. We want to support the member states who are basically saying that the 2009 targets to significantly reduce or eliminate the global drug market should not be extended beyond 2019. And that's where the fight will be in this resolution. We're also calling for very strong mention to civil society engagement in the resolution, including specific reference to the civil society task force that has now been reinvigorated and reinstated to help civil society prepare in the lead up to 2019 as well. So that's an important resolution to follow. The next one that we think is an important one in terms of following is L7. This is proposed by Norway. It's around promoting measures to prevent transmission of HIV and other bloodborne diseases associated with the use of drugs from mothers to babies during pregnancy, birth, or breastfeeding. This will be quite an interesting resolution in terms of how it will be received at the CND, but from Norway's perspective, it's an incredibly important one and builds on previous resolutions they've had that promote the response to HIV and considering how to deal with that in the current drug control context. And the final one that we'll mention here is also quite a groundbreaking resolution in the context of the CND, proposed by Canada and Uruguay now, and it's about removing stigma as a barrier to the availability and delivery of health, care, and social services for people who use drugs. The current wording is very positive. We see that, so it'll be interesting to see how this resolution progresses through the CND. But it's an important one. We have not had such a resolution on the issue of stigma previously. So moving on to side events and other events to look out for. If you download the program, you will see that there are numerous side events planned for this CND, 95 in total, spanning the 5 days. I'm not going to go through them, but it's good for you to look at them and consider which ones to attend. We also think it's important to attend the side events that perhaps don't chime so much with a harm reduction and human rights based approach, but it's important to go to some of those that are more around still, advocating for the drug-free world kind of narrative, and go to those side events and take note of what's being said and ask some questions and, meet some people, try and engage, I guess, colleagues who have a different perspective from perhaps most of the IDPC members. There will also be informal NGO dialogues, and these are important to attend. They've been hard fought for in previous years to actually have this space where civil society has an opportunity to meet with the key actors within the CND. So there will be an NGO dialogue with the UNODC Executive Director, with the President of the International Narcotics Control Board, and with the CND Chair. And there you will have an opportunity to engage with them. And I think the Vienna NGO Committee has already sought questions, predetermined questions in some of these spaces. But I've been to a few of these, and there's often opportunities at the end, time permitting, to ask questions also from the floor. And finally, please do take note, for those of you who are members of the Vienna NGO Committee, that there'll be an AGM, an annual general assembly actually, of the Vienna NGO Committee on the Thursday at 5 p.m. and that will include elections for all of the 6 board positions. So please do try to make it to that. And if you can't, remember you can vote by proxy in advance, but you need to make sure that you've indicated that to the Vienna NGO Committee well in advance. So I would encourage you to do so. So if you are already know that you can't be there, but you are a member. Finally, moving on to some key resources for NGOs. So again, here's the link to the official documents of the CND, or the resolutions are there. Also reports that have been prepared in advance for a number of issues by the UNODC and the CND Secretariat are there. Also, UNODC has developed a guide for CND participants, so that's also useful, as well as the Vienna NGO Committee guide for NGOs. And IDPC has a lot of information on the CND on our website as well. You can also download our hot off the press, updated and improved CND app from both the Apple and the Android stores. And this will help you to navigate the CND as well. We'll be trying to update in real time who's speaking at the plenary, which resolutions are being negotiated at the Committee of the Whole. And all side events are listed there as well, so you can tag the ones that you're interested in going to. There are some other key resources. We will have daily communications and emails advising you on the latest things that have happened and what's coming up for that day. If you wish to be a recipient of those emails, please send an email to sthing@idpc.net and you'll be added to that list. We'll also be updating the CND blog in English and Spanish in real time as things are happening. So you can also follow that. Ask your colleagues who cannot be at the CND, they can also follow there what's happening. And finally, another resource in terms of when member states are negotiating, we have developed the Book of Authorities, which looks at all UN agreed language or other language of authority on different issues relating from health, human rights, criminal justice reform, gender development on the Book of Authorities as well. Okay, so that's my section done. I will now hand over to Gabriel, who will give you his perspective on how his experience of attending the CND. So over to you, Gabriel.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here at this webinar and to talk to you about the experience of the Brazilian drug policy platform. For us, it's been very challenging to participate at the CND and all the international forums of discussions of drug policy. But we have been learning a lot, and IDPC has been very important to us to engage in those discussions. So I want to speak a little bit about the Brazilian drug policy platform. We are also a network of around 50 organizations, social movements, and research groups. We have 3 working groups. We divide the organizations in 3 working groups. One for the regulation of cannabis, one second for the healthcare and attention to drug users, and one third for discussing violence and incarceration due to drug policy in Brazil. We have 3 coordinators, the communication coordinator, Harumi, and scientific coordinator, Mauricio Fiori, and I am the institutional relations coordinator. I usually, I'm here in Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, and I'm usually working here with the legislative disputes about drug policy and also with the Supreme Court decisions. We also, I'm going to talk about the impacts of the drug policy in Brazil and why it's so important for us to engage in in international discussions about drug policy. We have a prison population of more than 700,000 people. 28% of those were detained on drug charges. And among the incarcerated women, it's worse. 68% are there for drug-related crimes. We don't have statistics about the impact of drug policy, of the drug prohibition on violent deaths, but we know there is an impact in violence because the drug prohibitions increase the power of criminal organization here in Brazil, and now we have around 60,000 violent deaths per year in Brazil. It's a terrible situation. In the healthcare system, we have a public mental health system, which is good, but it does not reach all who need it. So now we are facing pressure of the government also, but from civil society, from some religious groups, to replace this public mental health system for therapeutic communities. They are supported by those religious groups and political groups. They are very important in the elections because they have a lot of power in their communities, and also they face some problems about human rights abuse. So it's an important problem we are facing now. We started talking about acting internationally on the road to UNGAS 2016. We saw the UNGAS as an opportunity to advance in the discussions about the relation, the need for the human rights perspective on drug policy, and we had three main goals on those preparations. The need for recognition of the disproportionate racial impacts of the prohibition of drugs. especially in Brazil. It's very important for us and for our member, the Black Initiative for a New Drug Policy, which is also a network of organizations of social movements here in Brazil. One second goal was the use of alternative development programs for urban areas, because this is very often used for rural areas where the drugs are produced. But in Brazil, we have a very important problem of violence in communities affected by drug trafficking, not much affected by drug production. So we think the idea of alternative development is very important for these urban areas also. So this is one of our goals, and the importance of the proportionate sentencing in drug-related crimes. We didn't reach success in these goals, but we think we are advancing in those discussions. And last year, we participated in a discussion about this important, in a resolution, the importance of the discussion of racial impact of the drug policy. And there we face, I think, one of the big problems of the discussion about drug policy in international forums, which is the problem of reaching a consensus in polarized times. We are in polarized times in all of the world, in Brazil also, but in drug policy debate worldwide, we have a polarization that is very difficult to advance in drug policy debate. So at the same time, we have to fight death penalty for drug-related crimes. There are countries like Philippines that the president is defending the extrajudicial killing for drug users and drug traffickers. So, and at the same time, we have countries like Uruguay, some states of the United States, and now Canada, that are advancing on the discussion of the regulation of the market of some drugs like cannabis. How to do this in decisions based on consensus? One thing I think it's very important is the importance of framing. I mean, the importance of choosing the right words to communicate what we want in two ways. One, in proposing what we want. We have to find the way to propose it as a way it responds to what we want, and it contemplates what our oppositors there want also. And the importance of framing also when telling people what was decided, because these decisions, these resolutions are made based on consensus, so they are often contradictory, and they have problems and they have advances. So if we translate it to our countries as something framing the important things, framing what is good for us, we can also impact this positively in our countries. This is one of the things we learned about the international process. Also, one thing we learned working in those international forums was what is called by some professors the boomerang effect. So the drug policy in Brazil and also in many countries is something very difficult to discuss in the government and in the parliament and in the institutional power. So these discussions are often blocked. And the international forums and the international alliances are opportunities for us to make government hear us. Because in Brazil, if we talk about some problems, they may not hear. But if we go to the CND and there denounce what is going on here, the government will hear. The government will, they may not do anything about it, but it's an important opportunity for us to be heard. So we had some experience I want to talk about of this. One is the case of Anvisa. Anvisa is the regulatory agency for medical drugs. And Anvisa held an event last year on the regulation of cannabis for medical purposes. For years now, since 2014, when this discussion initiated here in Brazil, the associations of families and patients that make use of medical cannabis are complaining about being ignored by Anvisa. Anvisa is advancing on these discussions of regulating cannabis for medical purpose, but the families are not being included in those discussions. So at the event, we proposed to the associations to write a letter stating their complaints and denouncing that if Anvisa is advancing on these discussions, is because of the pressure of the families, and it wasn't being recognized by the agency there. So since then, Anvisa has sought to dialogue with the associations about the regulation of cannabis in Brazil, and it improved the relation and empowered the association here in Brazil. I think it was an important case of how this boomerang effect works. Also, one important way is when we have to pressure internationally for important things. One is the case of São Paulo's violent crackdown in Cracolândia. Cracolândia, I don't know if you know, Cracolândia is an open drug scene here in the center of the city of São Paulo, and it's a problem for the public officers in the city for years now. But last government, Fernando Haddad government, had an experience with harm reduction program. It was called De Braços Abertos. In English, it's open arms. The new mayor, now elected 2 years ago, he ended the program and sent police forces to remove the drug users from the streets. We denounced this violence through the IDPC network and at the side events at the CND and other international forums. This international repercussion helped social movements there in São Paulo to resist the mayor elections. We didn't convince Mayor Doria that he wouldn't end the program, but we did empower also the social movements to resist, and it's been a continued struggle to maintain some principles of the human rights and harm reduction program. At the CND now this year, we are holding an event also about the drug policy in Latin America. And we want to denounce also these changes we are facing in drug policy, specifically treatment of people based in communities and therapeutic communities. And internationally, I think I'm very worried, and because I think the conservative side of the global community, it's been empowered since the UNGAS, and I think we should have more action trying to convince other countries that we have to change drug policy and not trying to negotiate with them. So sometimes when we are being weakened, we try to negotiate, and we should polarize more. These are polarized times. So I think one important aspect we should be working in the next CND is also doing that. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. That was very comprehensive and also a very important perspective from Brazil. So yeah, please remember to ask your questions for Gabriel in the comment section of the YouTube channel. And now we move on to Sofía, who's from Diogenis in Greece. Sofía, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to participate in this webinar. I want to thank the IDPC team for inviting me to share a little bit about my experience at CND. I would like to suggest some points that might help people attending for the first time, and propose ideas on how civil society can engage more to the process, and present a couple of examples on how my organization disseminated the knowledge and lessons learned in Vienna at national level. As you will see, I have separated my presentation on 3 sections: before, during, and post-CND stages. First of all, I would like to make a short introduction of Diogenis Drug Policy Dialogue. Diogenis is a civil non-profit organization founded in 2010. Since 2015, the organization is based in Athens, Greece, and our basic aims are to promote an open, objective, and inclusive drug policy dialogue and drug law reform, which is human rights and public health oriented, both at national and regional level, as we are very active in our country, in Greece, but also across the region of Southeast Europe. We're trying to promote and strengthen cooperation and networking among all the relevant stakeholders, including decision makers, governmental and local authorities, state organizations, civil society, representatives from the community of persons who use drugs, scientists, researchers who are actively working in the field of psychoactive substances, and also to inform the general population on drug policy issues. We're having ongoing monitoring, and we're trying to share the knowledge regarding all the latest developments at national, region, and European and international level. We're an ECOSOC accredited organizations, and here you can see some bodies and organizations that we're members of. Despite the fact that that this is my 3rd consecutive year at the CND, I could say that I still feel like a newcomer to the proceedings, and I am still learning. So this is partly due to the complexity of the UN system and the decision-making processes, as well as the fact that many different sessions and meetings and events are taking place at the same time. So it's kind of an ongoing process. And here you can see some photos from me and my colleagues attending the 59th and the 16th CND in 2016 and 17 respectively. And so I can, just as a personal comment, I can say that my introduction to CND was kind of straight into the deep water, and challenging with lots of information to absorb, but very interesting at the same time, as it coincided with all the preparatory work and the follow-up of the very important ANGAS 2016. So I would like to make some points that new organizations that are participating for the first time, or they are new also to the CND, that might help you engage more effectively in the process. So take advantage of great resources that are provided by the IDPC through the emails and website for their alerts, the CND blog, which keeps an online record of previous CNDs and that you can also use while being at CND, and being informed in real time for what is happening in the sessions. And also, I strongly propose you to watch the video about CND 101, which is a great introduction to the to CND. I use also the UNODC information for participants, where I can find information about the agenda, the draft resolutions, and all the logistics. Also, I would like to strongly propose you to make some efforts and come into contact with your country delegation, exchange and share ideas on your country's positions to the CND, and also examine the possibility to attend the CND as part of the governmental delegation. Maybe it's because we have only 1 week left. I know that it might be at the last, we don't have much time to do this if you haven't already discussed with your government delegation, but consider this as an opportunity for the following years, because this can give you some additional and useful benefits by gaining access to sessions that otherwise are closed to civil society. Our experience from Greece is that we are kind of, we have some resistance from our delegation. We tried a couple of years now to ask them for a governmental pass to CND, but they keep on denying this opportunity. So in any other case, make sure that you have all acquired an ECOSOC pass. You already know about probably know the processes. If you're not an ECOSOC accredited organization, then some other NGOs can provide you with one of their passes if they're available. Also, I strongly recommend you to attend the IDPC orientation meeting. It is very useful. And it will take place on Sunday. I'm sure that you are already informed on that. And it is very helpful to prepare and inform other cooperating organizations that cannot attend CND regarding the content of the upcoming session, inform them on the initiatives that your government is taking at the CND, and draft resolution that might find interest. For example, this resolution that Anne told us before about the HIV may be of utmost importance for organizations working in the field of HIV. So share the knowledge and let them participate also, despite that they cannot be present at the CND. One last important thing before attending CND is to organize your schedule. Discuss with your colleagues, try to allocate your time correctly, and share events of common interest among you effectively in order to avoid overlap. In that way, I think that you can take the most out of the CND. And CND app is a great help on organizing your program. Next slide, please. I think. Thank you. Here is an example of some of our efforts to approach our national delegation before the 60th CND last year, when we're in collaboration with other NGOs, all being members of the Greek NGO platform for psychoactive substances. It's an informal initiative here from organizations working in the field of drugs, mainly in Athens, Greece. So, and this is an effort to maximize our influence and engagement. So we send a letter to the Prime Minister so that important issues raised by civil society are going to be included in our national delegation's position during the statements at the CND plenary, in order for the international community to have a more comprehensive picture of the current situation in our country. You might notice that sometimes government representatives present an ideal situation from their countries, while others are more honest and raise problematics and issues that have to be solved. In our case, the Greek delegation seems to be very optimistic and tends to describe a situation that is working very well, and we are getting abroad and we're making statements for our achievements, while on the other hand, we still have many problematic areas. For example, our main areas of advocacy that we're strongly trying to keep on pressing is that as a country, we do not have a national strategy on drugs, neither an action plan, since 2013, where 5 years where there has been no initiative to proceed with the formulation and the implementation of a national drug strategy and an action plan. Also, we keep on advocating for the legal recognition of harm reduction services, which every day are in danger in practice here in Greece. We also advocate for decriminalization of drug use, and we're trying to work to advocate for the active involvement of NGOs in the formulation, the implementation, and also the evaluation of the national drug policy. Let me go on with the next slide. Here you can see some photos from the IDPC orientation meeting that I was describing before. It's a really great opportunity to learn and to meet with representatives from other organizations that are working through common goals. And you can also build allies and collaborations. Now, during the CND, some points that you may want to take into consideration. There's the plenary where you can have a series of statements from governmental delegations, representative of government, UN agencies, and also civil society organizations can make a statement if they are ECOSOC accredited. They can apply for making a statement at the plenary regarding the current drug control situation and the national and regional priorities. It doesn't have so much the form of a debate, but it's just a series. More often, it's a series of statements. Also, it's the committee of the whole, which at my first time of attendance at the CND, I found very interesting. As it's very interesting to see the difference between the most conservatives and the most progressive countries, the interaction among them, and how they try to negotiate on wording on different resolutions and find the balance that will bring a consensus. It's a real dynamic and interesting process. If, of course, the resolution is going through the committee of the whole and not straight to informals. Side events are very of utmost importance. There you have the more chance for discussion, interaction, participation. It's a great opportunity for civil society organizations to have their voices heard. You can ask questions, and you can speak more free for different issues. If I can give you a recommendation, it would be, and also proposed that earlier, that it might be more interesting for you and influential to attend events you are less informed about, or you are more likely to disagree. So you can raise questions, you can open the debate, you can make more visible things that you think that are of advocating for drug policy, which is human rights and public health oriented. So also you can Next slide. It is very important. Some governments are more open to this, to arrange informal meetings with your government delegation or other key decision makers. At the corridors of the CND, you can have a coffee for like 10 minutes. It depends on the busy schedule of your governmental representatives, and you can advocate, you can present your position, discuss, and build relationship, establish contacts and cooperation. Not all the delegations are willing to do this, but you don't have to, you should take the chance to come closer to your government and see, discuss about their positions, raise the problematic areas that you think are most important for your country, and discuss on the possible resolutions that your government is proposing at the CND. Also, it is very interesting to participate at the formal dialogues that are coordinated by the Vienna NGO Committee. It's a great opportunity to also raise questions and raise issues to key decision makers like the untold before the INCB president, CND chair, or other key people. Do not lose if you're a member of the Vienna NGO Committee, do not lose the annual General Assembly. Also, it is very important to share the news outside the UN goals because not everybody has the opportunity to attend the CND. So keep on disseminating information or very interesting statements to your social media. There's a specific hashtag for CND, it's hashtag CND61, I think, and can verify this. And maybe an idea, I know it's tiring, but you can have some daily reports on what was going on during the day and publish them through your websites or social media. And also NGOs can share their publications and flyers on the NGO table. It is a good way to disseminate your work. Unfortunately, the space is limited, so choose your publications that think are the more influential, and the publications that you want people to know about. At last, I want to present you some initiatives that we have implemented after CND in our effort to disseminate important conclusions and information that can be used in a meaningful and important way at national level. Diogenis has been organizing informal meetings at national level regarding the post-CND update. And since 2016, these meetings have been organized in a more consistent way and formal way on a regular basis. Relevant stakeholders actively participate each year at these meetings, and they show much interest as they are not efficiently informed on CND proceedings and track policy developments in general by our governmental delegation. It seems that in that way, we managed to cover a big gap at national level, which gave more visibility to our organization, but also since the governmental delegation doesn't share the news from the CND or the conclusions of this important meeting, we have to share the knowledge with our colleagues and other interesting parties. So this will be the third consecutive year that we organize an open informative meeting. It will take place after the CND. And our goal also is this meeting to produce actual position papers which are signed by NGOs or other interesting parties that are present to the informative meetings in order to have more influence and present these papers to our state authorities. And lastly, one more idea that can be like an example for our organizations is that we have saved it was an idea that was shaped on a large extent. It's the next slide. Sorry, it's this idea was shaped on large extent due to an ongoing emphasis of the CND and the side events and the different resolutions on the thematic area of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as Anna was mentioned before. At national level, here in Greece, stakeholders were not much familiar with these goals, nor with the role that drug policy could have in the achievement of these goals. So, taking into advantage the knowledge that we built from CND on this issue, we implemented a project with the aim to inform and train local authorities and other key stakeholders on evidence-based policies and their important connections to the SDGs agenda. This was one more example of how we try to bring the knowledge back from CND to our country, and how we can be more efficient to our community by sharing this knowledge widely, because, as I told you before, here in Greece, people were not much familiar with drug policy issues, or even more specific areas of the drug policy umbrella thematics. So it's very important for us not to keep this information for our own, but to share it and try to train the audience and build cooperations and take advantage of these important sessions in practice. That was from my side. Thank you very much. I think that I hope that you find interesting the points that I.
Thank you very much, Sofía. That was very comprehensive and lots of really important and useful information there. I just wanted to reinforce a very clear point that you made, which I think is crucial, which was basically what happens after CND as well, in terms of making sure that we unpack and share the information that we've learned at the CND and the position of your government back with our colleagues at the national level. And I would encourage all of you attending CND to consider how that might happen. And some of the examples that Sofía gave there were really fantastic. So thank you very much for really bringing attention to that. And the related point I think to make is that for those of you, I know some who will be listening won't actually be coming to CND, but that doesn't mean that you can't influence what's happening there, because actually a lot of the work to influence government positions at the CND has to happen at the national level and has to happen before the CND. So you can already think about next year, and obviously if you follow closely with the information that as IDPC as a secretariat are putting out, you can think about how to influence what the positions national governments take, but in engaging with them at the national level well in advance of the CND and the UN meetings, because they'll decide their positions long before they come to Vienna in March. And so that's important to think about. And we will actually be doing a short briefing on that, a briefing note for our members, and we'll be releasing that after the CND with a particular view towards the 2019 process, but encouraging you to think through what you can do more at the national level to influence and engage your government. We don't actually have any questions in the YouTube chat, but just one thing I wanted to raise that sort of came up through Gabriel's presentation. Yes, how can we as reform organizations really try to push and achieve change in this very sort of polarized but still consensus-based discussion? And of course, post the UNGAS in 2016, I think we see increasing polarization in terms of their positions, to the point now where actually part of their negotiations for 2019, I think there are some proposals not even to have a negotiated outcome document or any resolution from 2019, which shows how polarized things are, because I think some sides already think, well, there's no point trying to negotiate a consensus when there is none. And that's something also for us to consider as a reform-minded community, whether or not we would want to continue pushing for them to achieve any kind of consensus when there really clearly is so little agreement. The other thing to say is that I think post-UNGAS, where we continue to see progress, or I suppose, breaks in terms of continue to break open the discussion in Vienna, is really to push on the human rights button. And that human rights button has been more firmly embedded in the process of the UNGAS outcome document. That space is opening. There is more interest and oversight from the human rights bodies of the UN than there ever has been before. And that started in the UNGAS process, and fortunately, with a lot of pressure from member states and civil society, advocacy is continuing. And this is an important lever, I think, for all of us to continue to push on in terms of the human rights dimension, because that brings accountability. And even the latest report of the International Narcotics Control Board that was released last week has a quite important language around the importance of the human rights provisions and drug control being in line with that. So I think that's an area where, as civil society, and it sort of builds on what Gabriel was saying around, the line that we have to hold in terms of where we want to see changes. And I think, that the human rights line provides us with a strong lever. So I think I will leave it there. Also, to confirm what Sofía questioned, the hashtag that we should use, and I do encourage lots of social media around the CND, is hashtag CND61. And I think that's going to be the one that the UN is actually using. So I think as civil society will also use that one. So thank you very much to Sofía. Thank you very much to Gabriel. Thank you for all of you for joining. And I look forward to seeing some of you next week. Cheers.